Hello folks, welcome back to our recorded lectures for ML103. This is Reimagining Ragnar Lothbrok in Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Now, as I mentioned in my announcement on the website, I am actually sticking to the 2 lectures this week rather than the 3. When I tried to do the one on the Danes and the Saxons, it became a bit derivative, both of stuff I've already done and stuff that is yet to be done in other lectures, so I thought it was best perhaps just to leave that out. And this sets us up for a fairly interesting prompt this week as well. All right, first of all, please admire the image I found for the title slide. This is a mod for Assassin's Creed Valhalla, an attempt to make Eivor look like Ragnar Lothbrok from Vikings, the TV series. The similarity was there already, but that is quite nicely done if I do say so. All right. So let's talk about the Ragnar of history. That is an artist's interpretation of Ragnar in the image, of course. Please note the scare quotes in the title of this slide. We can't really talk about the Ragnar of history in any sort of confident way. He is basically a saga hero who may have had some root in reality, but who becomes such an all-encompassing character, such a prototypical Viking, that his literary self basically swallows up any trace of the original source of inspiration, whatever that might have been. Now, the stories of Ragnar suggest that he claimed to be a direct descendant of Odin as a way of challenging for the throne, that he wore magical hairy breeches that protected him from being poisoned, hence Lothbrok, hairy breeches. He used these breeches to save his first wife from a dragon, incidentally. Stories also tell us that he led the 845 attack on Paris. Now, we do know that the Northmen did attack Paris in 845, but according to the Frankish sources, it was led by a Norse chieftain called Ragnar, who is only identified with Ragnar by some scholars. Is there any actual evidence that he was Ragnar Lothbrok? No, because Ragnar is not an uncommon name among the Northmen at this point in history. He is supposedly exiled from Denmark after having had a falling out with King Horik, who confiscates his raiding wealth. He doesn't do this because he's greedy. He does this because the Frankish ruler Louis the German, Charlemagne's son, is getting angry, supposedly, at how much success Ragnar is having. Ragnar has to leave, and he begins raiding along the shores of the Irish Sea. He becomes a legendary raider in the British Isles. His 4 sons are also recognized as paragons of the ideal Viking. Now, his exile supposedly ends when Horik is murdered, but Ragnar is said to have died on his way back home and never returned to Denmark. There are actually multiple different stories about his death. I just want to cover the most famous, which is the version where he is shipwrecked off the English coast and taken prisoner by Aella of Northumbria. King or Elderman Aella executes him by throwing him into a pit of vipers and leaving him to die. Aella even stripped him of his famous breeches so that he could make sure that the snakes poisoned him. Now, this comes from the 13th century saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, and his last words, according to the saga, were, "When the boar bleats, the piglets come." And this is a warning that his sons would avenge him. And in both the saga tradition and, interestingly, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the men who call themselves the sons of Ragnar are the ones who lead the great army in England, specifically looking for vengeance for their father. Now, here's the kicker. Ivar, Ubba, Halfdan, Bjorn, Sigurd, the sons are all historical figures. We have other sources that attest to the fact that they were real. But this sort of thing is not uncommon in the early Middle Ages, where you see a legendary genealogy connected with a real genealogy. The king lists in particular are very good at doing this. You always have to wonder where the legend of a kingdom's formation ends and the actual kingdom's history begins. Now, certainly we cannot entirely rule out the idea that some of Ragnar's story may have been real. We can't disprove it, but we also can't prove it. So many of our sources for these details are from the 12th and the 13th century, but they almost certainly drew on oral tradition that existed before then. Scholars still look for a historical Ragnar, but it's impossible to reconcile all the accounts of what Ragnar did with any of the known lives of the historical candidates that they have for the role. In a way, it's as pointless as looking for the historical King Arthur. But as a literary character, he's unforgettable. He's a personification of the ultimate raider. He's the reason for the great army. It's why popular culture can't leave him alone. Now, obviously, the best known modern depiction of Ragnar is Travis Fimmel's depiction of him in History's Vikings series. I would say that's probably the standard by which any future 21st century representation of Ragnar is going to be judged, and in a broader sense, how most 21st century representations of any Viking are going to be judged. That's how much influence that show has had on the popular perceptions. All right. So, Ragnar in Assassin's Creed Valhalla has been dead for years by Ivar's time, obviously, given that the game is set well after the invasion of the Great Army. Ragnar, however, is an oddly pervasive presence in the storyline. He is constantly referred to almost from the beginning. He appears within the game world as the same sort of ultimate Viking that he does within the world of the sagas. His name is constantly evoked as a model for what could potentially be achieved in England, the heights to which a raider could rise. Ragnar would do it this way. We'll emulate Ragnar. We will fight like Ragnar and conquer like he did. Now, obviously, his most significant legacy in England are his sons, and there are 3 of them active at the time the game is set. Ivar the Boneless, the rather scary-looking guy in the image there, Ubba, and Halfdan. And they are consistently referred to as the Sons of Ragnar. This is a distinct collective group that distinguishes them from their fellow Northmen. Now, we don't see Bjorn or Sigurd. The implication is perhaps that they died before the beginning of the game. Now, the game's Sigurd, Eivør's brother, and Eivør as well, are hoping to connect with the Sons of Ragnar when they arrive in England. In fact, their eventual settlement, Ravensthorpe, was originally a camp owned by the Sons of Ragnar. Now, Ubba and Ivar can be the first allies that Sigurd and Eivør seek out. Depends on whether you as the player decide that you want to go to Leicestershire or Grantbridgeshire first. They have the same level requirements, so it's entirely up to you. It doesn't really have any impact on your progress through the game, which you do first. You do have to do both. I mean, yes, you do have to connect with the Sons of Ragnar, but you also have to connect with Soma, the Jarl Skona, or female Jarl, in Grantbridge, because she is your eventual connection to Guthrum, and you do need to be aware of Guthrum, obviously, to complete the game. Now, the backstory of the game preserves some of the specific details of Ragnar's death from the original sources. Ivar, for instance, kills Aella, his father's murderer, in a Blood Eagle ritual. And he and his brothers are involved in manipulating the politics of both Mercia and Northumbria, as per the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Now, Halfdan is the most powerful figure in the north of England. He's manipulating events in Northumbria and through his agents in the south as well. He has a puppet king in Northumbria to begin with, but then rules on his own. He's also fighting the Picts. Ubba and Ivar are busy in Mercia and the south. Now, all 3 Sons of Ragnar are key NPCs. Halfdan in particular is likely meant to be the reincarnation of the Isu Thor, because he has the same voice actor and the same mannerisms, although that's never explained in the actual storyline. Now, in some ways, the 3 sons actually take on different aspects of their father, and it's a really interesting representation. I mean, Ivar is the ruthless reaver, the murdering Northman. Ubba is the one who sees what they can build in England and is trying to make connections with other Danes and with Saxons. And Halfdan is the warrior king, the one who rises to the top. Now, another meaningful connection to Ragnar's story comes with a side quest line involving figures known as the Lost Drengrs of Ragnar Lothbrok. So Eivor encounters the six of them at various points in their travels in Norway and in England. So these are aging warriors. They are survivors of Ragnar's original raiding group, but they outlived their lord, and so they have lived all the years since in seclusion and despair, expecting to die of old age and never reach Valhalla. And the implication is that they deserve to do so because they did outlive Ragnar instead of dying with him. Now, if you think back to when we talked about the warband, this is a problem because you are not expected to outlive your lord. As a member of the warband, you are supposed to die at his side. So their greatest wish is for someone to offer them an honorable death. Eivor, of course, can do so. Although it does take quite some time before Eivor is of a high enough level to do so. Even the weakest of these elderly fighters is still a significant opponent. Eivor gets to speak to each of them before the fight, and they reminisce about Ragnar in often very poetic terms. They talk about what it was like to fight beside him in their youth. It's almost like they're looking back on a golden age of what it was to be a Viking. Now, in one case, Eivor fights an old man, Thor the fishmonger, in front of his young son. There's some really interesting dialogue here. So this Thor married a Saxon lady and settled on the land because he had started as a farmer back in Norway, and he fell in love with the richness of the land in England. He wanted to farm there. But he always regretted parting with Ragnar, not being there at the snake pit to try and save him, or at least die with him. So when it's just him and his son left, and his son is old enough to fend for himself, he decides he has to die as a drengr and show his son what he needs to be as he grows into a man. And Eivor, of course, will oblige him. Now, Eivor also kills another drengr who's basically gone mad, and this drengr tells Eivor that Ragnar was the only one who could keep him in check, who could keep him from being a drogr. He claims he's the walking dead, that trolls will fear him. Now, when Eivor kills him, they reassure him that Odin will welcome him as long as he fights hard and drinks harder. Now, in one case, the only female drengr, who's in the image here, reveals to Eivor that she learned how to practice Scyther from Ragnar. And that's really interesting. It's perhaps a reference to Ragnar's supposed kinship to Odin, that he knows the same type of forbidden magic that Odin did. So the female drengr tells Eivor that in order to fight her, Eivor has to take the potion that she offers, and that was a potion that she and Ragnar would always take before battle, and she would see Ragnar, quote, transcend the laws of battle once he was under its influence. Now, the last of the drengr is my favorite, actually. His name is Orwig Neverdeath, and he claims, when Eivor encounters him, that he is impervious to anything but the steel of a true drengr. And Ragnar realized that. So Ragnar said to him, "You are only allowed to carry shields." So he carries a shield on either arm, and he was trained by Ragnar to be an unbeatable defender and put at the center of each of Ragnar's shield walls. But because no one can kill him, he wasn't able to join Ragnar in death, which is haunting him, the poor guy. So Eivor offers to try and break the shield wall finally, and just barely manages to do it. This is an incredibly tough fight. Orwig has one of the highest power ratings in the game. You basically need to have completed the entire game and probably both DLCs before you can fight Orwig successfully. His power rating is something like 340, which is ridiculous. Now, whatever order you defeat them in, once you defeat the last one, you find a scroll. And it is a scroll that contains a copy of the Krakumal of Ragnar Lothbrok, so his death song, basically. It's the monologue that he supposedly gave as he was dying in the snake pit. And according to the scroll, it was transcribed by one of Eala's soldiers who considers himself to have been changed forever by hearing it. And it reflects on life as a warrior, on his hope for revenge, and for an afterlife in Valhalla. So the poem also describes the site of Ragnar's death, and Eivor is able to locate the pit. The player actually has to fight through the snakes who still live within in order to get down there safely. And once you do, you see the cage that held Ragnar. Eivor's imagination reconstructs the scene, as it so often does when they're trying to sort out what happened at a given location. And they imagine his last words, and they're drawing on the poem, which is a real thing, as they do so. Eivor appreciates that Ragnar faced death without fear, and they take a great deal of pride in having sent his drengr on to join him. And as sort of a final reward for completing this quest, they actually find Ragnar's dagger, half buried in the earth. So now they're carrying one of Ragnar's own weapons. Sort of a payment, one might say, for the service that they did Ragnar and his drengr. Now, it is a side quest. It doesn't have any particular influence on the main quest line of the game. You don't even get comments from the sons of Ragnar if you kill their father's drengr. But it is a fascinating side quest because it ties into not just the legendary background of the Great Army, but also Norse literature. And it also helps to establish Eivor as a legendary drengr as well, someone capable of defeating the champions of Ragnar and basically doing them the kindness of sending them to be with their lord. Now, so often some of the strongest writing in Viking-inspired games like this comes in side quests. I would argue because side quests don't have to be overcomplicated, and they're usually self-contained. There's a technical term from game studies that's sometimes used, micro-narratives, which is something that I've been looking more into, not just with Valhalla, but also with The Witcher 3. A lot of the times the world building is done through micro-narratives primarily. Now, why I think this particular quest line is so successful is the level of reflection that both the drengr and Eivor have on the Viking warrior ideal. So much of their dialogue, when they're talking to each other, when they're reminiscing about the old days, sounds like it's cribbed directly from Norse literature. It just feels very authentic. Okay, so that is Ragnar. I shall be back shortly with King Alfred.